morning there, boys and girls, and welcome to another episode of Adventures of the Broke and Retired. Thank you very much for being able to make it here today. I really do appreciate it. I love seeing you. I love talking to you. I love to hear what you have to say, what you have to think. Talk to me whenever every chance you get. I'm your old buddy Don, and I'm here with my dedicated but maybe not so dependable remote, Elmer, the Reckless Remote. We're here to provide you with another video full of questions you didn't know you had and things you didn't know that you didn't know. I need to add in here that I don't present this as historical fact. This is just something that I'm interested in. It's kind of an overview of a subject that I'm interested in. I hope that you find it interesting as well. I'm not an expert on any subject at all. I'm just a guy who has a camera and a remote and likes to hang out with the both of them. In the beginning, there was madness and chaos and anger and injury. There was speed, there was terror, there was fear. There was fear of something new, fear of something that was undependable, uncontrollable, unpredictable, unfamiliar, and unsafe. There was the first appearance of the motor car. It was looked upon by many as a vile killing machine whose only practical use was to frighten every horse in town. There was a brief period in time when the motor car was making its very first appearance on the streets and roads of this country. I say brief because after making its initial splash, the motor car very rapidly became a common sight. Not that people necessarily wanted to see them. Yeah, there were a lot of people who were fascinated by these newfangled machines, and a motor car would draw a crowd wherever it went. But there were just as many people disgusted by them as there were in awe. So if you would, take a minute to join me in a walk back in time, and we'll sit back and look over some of the changes that took place in society with the introduction of the motor car. Once the motor car started coming around, let's pretend, okay? Let's imagine we are in your average town. Doesn't matter, East Coast, doesn't matter. You're in your average town, late 1800s. How'd you get there? Well, the undisputed champion of transportation in the late 1800s in the United States was undoubtedly the railroad. The railroads had come to be, and then they had very quickly crisscrossed the entire country. If you were traveling or if you were transporting goods, you were doing it by railroad. The railroad companies had the transportation business figured out. They had the transport of goods and people figured out completely. They had it down pat. You could literally set your watch by the railroad. Entire cities were built or broken by the railroads. The way to go was by rail. No question about it. That is, as long as the rails went to where you wanted to go, which was not always the case. The rails, the trains, ran from train station to train station. Getting to and from the station, you were left up to your own devices. If you were traveling with a large group, or if you had equipment that had to come along with you, then I'm sure that the stations at both ends of the trip, the stations had horses and wagons and hands you could hire to move that equipment and that stuff for you. If there was goods to be dropped at the station for pickup later, I'm sure there was hands there to be had to do that. If you weren't going far from the station, then chances are pretty good you would just walk. And it's that walk where I'd like to start the story. Transportation in town after you got off the train was done by either foot or by horse. To my knowledge, those were the only choices, unless you watch Back to the Future. Those were the only choices. That means that at any given time, the train station in town, at any given time, there were literally dozens and dozens, if not more, horses. And these horses were most likely stacked up, for the most part. A large amount of them were stacked up around the train station because that's where the work for them was. Just like if you go to the airport now, there's a row of taxis or rental car places are all right there at the airport, so they're convenient for your use. Difference being, there's a number one thing and a number two thing that taxi cabs and rental cars don't do, which would be number one and number two. Let's visit this scene just for a minute if we can. You're on the train as it pulls into the station. The train slows way down, and in the open windows of the car you're in, starts coming the smell of the station, which is going to be probably 90% horse poop, because there had to have been a lot of horse poop everywhere because there were so many horses around. And I'm sure, like I said, they hung out at the stations because that's where the work was. So you're on the car and the train slows down and you start smelling all that horse poop. And when the train stops, you go over to the stairs down, and first thing you do is look at the ground at the bottom of the stairs to make sure it's not a big pile of horse poop. You hope it's not, but if it is, you don't have a lot of choice but to step in it, which is you're probably pretty much used to anyway. And once you're out of the way, all the people getting on the train are going to step in it and track it all up inside the car. But that's what people were used to. So, tracking horse poop in the train cars probably didn't make a whole lot of difference to people. Once you're past that point and you're up on the platform and you get up into the station, which is probably full of horse poop as well because there's people coming in from outside and there's horses everywhere. So it's probably full of horse poop too. And what you're doing, I should say, in this imaginary tale is you're standing there and you're gonna look out across the street, across the town that you can see from the station. If you're a singular traveler, you're going to walk to where you're going to go. So you stand there and you look out across the street to see what you see. Now, I want to interrupt myself here just for a minute because it occurs to me that let's pretend for a minute that you're in a town up north where the ground stays frozen half the year, and you pull up in that train station right in the middle of the spring thaw. There's 6 months of frozen horse poop that's thawing. The stink had to have been horrible. The flies and the bugs and all that stuff must have just been horrible. Sometimes it really just amazes me that people lived at all. You didn't go get a tetanus shot every few years back then because they didn't exist. There's a whole bunch more nasties of close quarters between so many people and so many animals that I could come up with, but I don't want to do that because that's not the point of the video. I would like you to keep it in mind because it's an important thing to remember, just to add the reality of the situation. But it's not important. That's not the point of the video. So let's forget about the frozen ground for a minute. Let's get back to just stepping off the train where the ground's not frozen. So I'm going to imagine that the train station is probably pretty close to the center of town. And I'm going to imagine that because chances are pretty good, pretty much everything that happens in town comes and goes on the train. So that's where all the comings and goings are going on. That's where all the activity is. I'm going to imagine that the stagecoach stations were probably right there by the train stations as well, because you got off the train. If the tracks didn't go to where you wanted to go, you got off the train, got on the stagecoach, and went to your destination from there, which meant more horses. So you stand there on that platform and you're looking out, okay? And what would you hear and what would you see? Well, I'd imagine that you would hear the train at rest. Hang on. Phone calls. I would imagine that you would hear the train at rest, hissing and groaning and being reloaded with wood or coal or oil, whatever it was fired on, and water. Passengers and freight being unloaded and uploaded onto the train. You would hear the plodding of horses pulling wagons around town. You'd hear people talking. You'd hear maybe the sounds of a saloon close by, whatever sounds may be coming out of it at that moment. What you would see is storefronts and of course a bunch of horses and wagons all tied up at hitching posts and water troughs and people coming and going and probably piles of horse poop everywhere. And lots of things just kind of slowly moving through town. When I say slowly moving through town, I imagine that the pace of town, the town's pace, was probably set by the speed of a walking horse, which is about 4 miles an hour. There's a good possibility there were some people that hurry. You might see somebody run by. You might see somebody gallop a horse through town if they're really in a hurry, but galloping a horse through town was a pretty dangerous thing to do, not only for you but for your horse, and for every other man, child, woman, or beast that happened to be there, because nobody's expecting things to be moving that quickly. Everything moves at about the pace of a walking horse. If you were to go galloping through town, and you hurt somebody, I'm sure that they'd be obliged to hurt you back for being so stupid. There were no laws of the streets. There were no traffic laws. They didn't exist. They didn't need to. Like I said, if you acted stupid and got hurt, you'd either get hurt your horse, or hurt somebody else. And if you hurt somebody else, then they'd probably hurt you for hurting them. If you got too drunk to ride your horse home, you could pretty much just fall over right there where you were, or maybe the sheriff would come put you in jail just to save you from yourself, save you from getting beat up and robbed. At least in jail, you'd be basically safe. But then came the motor car, and it all changed because the motor car forced it to change. Now, there's some problems that the motor car may have improved upon and eventually eliminated, like horse poop being everywhere, because if there's fewer horses around, then there's fewer horse number one and horse number two to have to deal with. As they were phased out, as the horses were phased out for the automobile, it probably reduced the stench and the illness, the sickness, disease, quite a bit, because you didn't have all the poop flies and bugs and all that kind of stuff all running around everywhere. Also, with that many animals in town, I'm going to reckon that there was a whole bunch of people and places as well that probably had a pretty good population of lice, because lice like horses, as far as I know. I've never owned a horse. As far as I know, that's true. But there's also, along with some of the problems they fixed, there's a whole lot more that they created. When a motor car first came around, its normal operating speed was about the same as that of a walking horse, 4 miles an hour. Now, they were capable of doing double that, and come on, nobody's going to drive through town at 3 or 4 miles an hour. They're all going to want to show off and go fast, show that they can go faster than a horse. And as time went on, very quickly as time went on, the automobiles got much faster, much quicker. Within just a few years, cars were capable of going 4 or 5 times the speed of a horse regularly. They could easily move along at that speed. And that increase in speed made really a huge difference, because you got to keep in mind that the pace of the town was basically set by the speed of a walking horse. No one was anticipating, no one was ready for anything that could and would routinely move faster than the speed of a walking horse. Now, if you take the increased speed with the fact that the early motor cars had poor brakes. They didn't put brakes on all wheels. They might either put them on the front or the back. They didn't necessarily have brakes on all the wheels. They had poor brakes. They had poor throttle control. They had poor steering. They had poor control in any way you can think of it. And virtually no one was an experienced driver, because cars hadn't existed. So there couldn't be an experienced driver. So everyone was a newbie behind the wheel. And all this going on also tended to scare the horses, which made things even worse. What you ended up with was basically streets full of chaos. And if you were stupid or you were drunk, your horse was a living, dependable, trustworthy companion that could think for you. Your motor car didn't do that. Your horse could carry you home over the saddle, and eventually you'd get there. Your motor car, it went wherever you pointed it, and it went at the speed you made it go. It had no mercy, thought, or controls of its own. It just did whatever you told it to do. And if you were stupid enough to tell it to do something stupid, it would do it. So we talked about the train station platform before the automobiles came around. Let's look at what happened a few years after. Let's say you're standing on that train platform a few years after the motor cars come to town. First of all, the walk that you made from the platform to your hotel or to your destination, whatever it was no longer just a game of step around the poop. There was less poop to have to step around, but there were people buzzing around in cars. There was no traffic control. There were people buzzing around everywhere in cars, and there were horses and wagons. It was more like a dodgeball game than it was walking across the street, because it was a lot easier to walk around poop that didn't move than it was to try to stay out of the way of things that were moving and were moving quickly. So the whole pace of the towns changed. The sounds of the towns changed as well. Used to be, you'd hear a horse plodding along and the wagon wheels kind of rolling through the dirt, and maybe the sounds from the saloon down the street kind of drifting your direction. Wasn't like that anymore. Now it was a bunch of bulb horns and people hollering and horses horses being spooked, and loud exhaust because they didn't put mufflers on cars in the beginning. They didn't see any need to. Cars didn't have mufflers, just open exhaust. And of course, all the noise that the cars themselves made. So the sounds that you heard changed as well. The motor car brought chaos to the streets. And not only did it bring chaos to the streets, it brought chaos to the streets that would stay there and would continually get worse every day. No traffic laws. So cars and horses and wagons just kind of, especially motor cars, just kind of darted in and out of anywhere they had to go. They were moving quick. You had to watch out for them, and they just kind of zipped around. They didn't have diddly for brakes, so they just kind of zipped around wherever they had to go, trying to get to wherever they got to get. No regard for anybody else. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. It was just no regard for anyone's safety but their own. The first few years that motor cars were on the streets were actually just total madness. There was anything, anytime, no controls, no guidelines. No guidelines had ever been needed. No guidelines had ever been considered up until that time. There was just no need for them. You think about that for a minute. And I mean, really think about it for a minute and draw a picture in your mind. No standard procedures in place at all. No rules about which side of the street you drove on. No stop signs, no right of way, no parking, no parking laws, no pedestrian laws, no speed limits, no mufflers, no driver's licenses, no driving age restrictions, no traffic lights, no nothing. One of these days, just for fun, one of these days when you're sitting around, maybe you got a big pot of spaghetti on the stove cooking. I love cooking spaghetti. Hey, it bloop the sauce all day. The house smells so good. And if it's cold or raining outside, just the thought of it warms you to the bone. Anyway, sometime while you're sitting around doing that, grab yourself a piece of paper and a pencil and make a note of every rule, restriction, regulation, law, whatever you want to call it. Every one that has anything to do with an automobile. I guarantee you it'll take you and your friends a couple of hours to come up with a big old list of them because there's so many. And when you get done, you feel like you're happy. You feel like you've written down all you're going to think of. Review that list and realize that at one point in time, none of those rules existed. Everything was just wide open. There was no safety restrictions. There was no nothing. The automobile, or the motor car, it was as it was referred to back then, was completely unrestricted. And it stayed that way. The automobile and its movements. The automobile and the use of the automobile is a better way to put it. Was completely unrestricted and unregulated. And it stayed that way until enough people got hurt, until enough horses got hurt, and until enough property was damaged, and until enough of the right people got inconvenienced. Then finally the powers that be figured out something needed to change. So they put these commissions together so they could come up with ideas on how to fix this problem, but none of them really had a clue on what to do. I mean, this was all new stuff. This was all a completely clean slate. Nobody really came up with anything half decent right off the bat. And then, well, let me tell you this story first. This is important to understand first. By the time this next story comes around, the surface of the streets in places that were heavily populated, more populated, I shouldn't say heavily populated, but that were more populated, the surface of those streets had already been hard surfaced. The dirt streets by that time in places like that were already gone. And they were gone because they were a mess. They were a mess to deal with. They made everything around them a mess. They were muddy. They were dusty. They were holey. They were rutted. They were nasty. They had to figure out a way, so they started hard surfacing the streets. So by the time this comes around, the streets in the cities were not dirt anymore. So there's this guy, his name was Edward N. Hines. In the year's 1911, and Mr. Hines is riding down the road, and he gets stuck behind a horse-drawn milk wagon. And the milk wagon is plodding along at its 4 miles an hour. And as it's plodding along, the milk is leaking out. And it's leaving a white line down the road as it goes. And dude's mind comes up with an idea. Light bulb went off in his head. The control of traffic could be done with a simple white line down the middle of the road. So they painted the lines, and then they told the drivers, you on this side of the line, you go that way. You on that side of the line, you go this way. And it worked instantly. And it worked like a champ. And it spread like wildfire. And every line you see painted on a road today is an ancestor of the milk leaking out of the back of that wagon. Now tell me that ain't something.